Well, welcome back, and we'll be closing out Matthew's Gospel today, chapters 27 and 28. We're moving from this section of the Passion of the King. We're going to close that up and then open this new section, the crucifixion and resurrection of the King. Just a reminder, if you're in town, love to see you on Sunday at First Baptist Church, the Estes Park Baptist Church, where I'll be preaching on Sunday. Down below the video are some links. Is a link to the Estes Park Baptist Church website if you need directions or if you want to watch it online. So we've already talked about at the end of chapter 26 how Jesus was before the high priest in this one of three religious trials. He was found guilty of blasphemy. Then when we come into chapter 27, the first couple of verses are another religious trial, kind of a summary, validating or verifying the guilty verdict that's already been passed on Jesus with regard to blasphemy. And then we have Judas's death. Now Judas is remorseful over what's happened. He sees Jesus has been sentenced to death, and he is filled with guilt. This is not what he intended. Exactly what he did intend is not explained to us. Some have speculated that what Judas was trying to do was bring things to a head so that Jesus would reveal himself as king and bring in the kingdom. Others are thinking that perhaps Judas, disappointed with the direction Jesus' ministry has taken, wants to rob him of any authority or credibility he has with the people, thinking that this religious trial would do just that, but it didn't. It's resulted in Jesus' death. So Judas is remorseful. Wouldn't say repentant. There's no evidence here Judas is repenting. He's very sorry for what he's done, but that's not the same as repentance. And he goes out and he kills himself. A tragic ending to Judas. And then we see in verses 11 through 25, Jesus is brought before Pilate. So if you recall back in chapter 26, verse 65, the charge was blasphemy. If you look at chapter 27, verse 11, Pilate asked Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus says, "It is as you say," which has now shifted the charge from blasphemy under the religious authorities to sedition under the political authorities. And notice how Jesus, in accordance with Isaiah 53:7, which you've read already, that he opened not his mouth, that Jesus, to defend himself, Jesus is not resisting going to the cross. He knows what's coming, and he's not resisting it. Imagine the scene in Pilate's throne room in the Praetorium, it's called. Praetorium is the general term for the governor's residence. Pilate's there. Jesus is there. The chief priests and the Pharisees are there. They are yelling at Pilate these accusations against Jesus. Pilate's questioning Jesus himself. And then in comes Pilate's wife's representative in verse 19, possibly what we call in medieval times a lady's maid, some servant representing her. She comes in, or he comes in, and he gets Pilate's attention with a message from his wife, which says, "Have nothing to do with that righteous man. I've had a dream about him." Well, this is really interesting, and it's the only place that this is brought up. Matthew's the only one who talks about this. In first century Rome, aristocratic women were commended for giving good advice to their husbands. And also, dreams were thought to be a source of revelation from the gods. So she is bringing this message warning Pilate. I think what's going on here, it could be Satan trying to rescue Jesus from the cross in order to frustrate God's plan for salvation. That's a possibility. But I think within the context here, I think it's more likely that this is really a message that's sent by God to Pilate's wife in a way that she would recognize its supernatural source and authority, and then related to Pilate, and he would also have recognized the supernatural source and authority of it. But Pilate tries to absolve himself of the guilt of Jesus' death. He's going to shortly here try to wash his hands of his blood. I think what Matthew is telling us is Pilate understood in his own way, his own language, so to speak. He got revelation that he would trust that Jesus was righteous. And just like the Pharisees and the Sadducees, just like the scribes, they rejected the evidence that was before them, and they brought on themselves guilt. So I think that's what's happening here. Pilate is not guiltless. He can't absolve himself of the guilt. And then they insist on Jesus' crucifixion. I think why crucifixion is insisted on and not some other source of death is, again, they're trying to discredit Jesus. Deuteronomy 21:23 that says that whoever is hung on a tree is cursed by God. So I think the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the scribes, all the leaders of Israel, are trying to disparage Jesus and show that he's cursed by this crucifixion. But it's going to have just the opposite effect. Jesus' death on the cross is going to be followed by his resurrection. So their insistence on crucifixion was instrumental in him being raised from the dead and proven to be approved by God, that death could not hold him. In verses 26 through 66, then, we see the crucifixion itself. There's a period of preparation here in verses 27 through 32. One of the things that might catch your attention is Jesus is offered this wine, diluted, or see what the word here, wine mixed with gall. This is a kind of either an anesthetic or a poison. Depends, I guess, on the dose that you take. If it's an anesthetic, it's a compassionate offer to Jesus to deaden the pain that he's about to experience on the cross. If it's poison, it's an opportunity to hurry up the process and die quickly. Jesus refuses that. Why does he refuse it? Because he is giving himself fully and completely and totally into the hands of his Father. Whether this is a painful process or God takes him quickly, whether this is a short process or a long process, Jesus is leaving that in God's hands. So he is not using any kind of drug, any kind of anesthetic, any kind of poison to try to manipulate this situation. And then Jesus is crucified. And again, we see in verse 46 how he calls out plaintively, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Well, we know from multiple promises throughout the Bible that God does not forsake his people. He may punish them. He may bring severe chastisement on them. Jesus, for example, here on the cross, is bearing the punishment that all that violence of the Old Testament only hinted at. That God's outrage at sin is being fully borne by Jesus. We've seen examples of his outrage in the destruction of Jerusalem, in the wholesale slaughter of his people. That's all expression of Jesus' outrage, but the outrage is seen here on the cross. And Jesus has this subjective sense that God has abandoned him. God has not. God is working out his plan, but Jesus has this sense that God has abandoned him. And then finally in verses 45 through 50, Jesus dies. Again, there's a series of unusual events that Matthew relates. The first one is that the temple, in the temple, there's a curtain, a very large curtain that separates the holy place from the Holy of Holies, where the Ark of the Covenant is. This is torn in two from top to bottom. Matthew doesn't explain why. So commentators rush in there and they have explanations, right? So I found 5 different explanations about what's going on there. I'm not going to tell you what I think, but because there's a lot of other opinions out there. One opinion is this symbolically opens the way for man to enter in to have communion with God, fellowship with God directly. Another idea is that this makes the law, Mosaic law, obsolete. This is a symbol showing that that law is now obsolete. And of course, that holy place and Holy of Holies were marked out in the Mosaic law. This is some think this is the end of the old covenant and the start of the new. That this is marking a significant change here, and it certainly is a change. Another set of opinions is that this is symbolic of the fact that Jesus is replacing the temple with himself, his own body. And finally, that this foreshadows the coming destruction of Jerusalem. That this is being destroyed now as a token of the destruction that's going to come. I'll let you think about it and study this yourself to see what you think. A second sign is the resurrection of the Old Testament saints. Again, I'm not going to burden you with all the opinions that are about this that range from, well, let me just say that they seem to be raised up. Matthew is reporting these things. We can take it as reliable, whether they died again, whether they were assumed into heaven. That just does not say. But we have this sign that accompanies Jesus' resurrection or Jesus' crucifixion, indicating or suggesting that his death becomes the grounds or the means or the reason why both Old Testament saints and in the future New Testament saints are going to be raised from the dead. And then finally, we have the witness of these soldiers here who see what's happened, and they say that this must be the Son of God. I don't think they're using that phrase in the Jewish sense that this is Yahweh's Son. In fact, Yahweh himself, if you look in John 5:17. I think what they're saying is that Jesus is a supernatural person, that he is a God-like figure. He died in a way that suggests that he is more than man, I think is what they're saying there. Wish I could get into the burial of Jesus when Joseph of Arimathea, actually a member of the Sanhedrin, happens upon the scene. Shows us again that the whole Sanhedrin were not consulted, not assembled. Probably Nicodemus wasn't there either. So another illegality for his trial. Then in chapter 28, I'll just finish quickly here. We have two things: the proof of the king in verses 1 through 17, 1 through 15, and then the promise of the king in verses 16 through 20. The proof of the king, I think I said that wrong, verses 1 through 17. We see these proofs that Jesus is king. We see the empty tomb. We see the risen Lord resurrected and appearing to these women in verses 8 through 10. And then the conspiracy to cover this up, to hide this. If you're a assassination conspiracy theorist, for example, maybe rooted here in verses 11 through 15, where they're coming up with a plan to deny the resurrection of Jesus. And then finally, the appearance to the disciples in verses 16 through 17. These are all proof that Jesus is raised from the dead, that death could not hold him, that he's approved by God, that he is, in fact, Israel's king. And then we see his priorities as the chapter closes out in verses 16 through 20. We see the priority of making disciples. Jesus tells them, commands them to go and make disciples. And he explains how disciples are made. He says, because by baptizing them and teaching them everything that he commanded them. That's how disciples are made. You don't get baptized first and then become a disciple. You become a disciple, and in that process, you become baptized and you learn to obey. That's what Jesus' priority is there. And that priority is rooted in the fact that all authority has been given to him. Global authority has been extended to Jesus. Earlier, the ministry was just to Israel. Now it's to the whole world. And Jesus is going to be with them in that ministry. So if you're in a church that doesn't make disciples, if you're in a church that is not making disciples the way Jesus said, perhaps you're not relying on Jesus' power. Perhaps Jesus is not present with you, and you want to pray for his presence. So brothers and sisters, as we see our risen Lord, we recognize him as King, we recognize him as sovereign over the whole earth. Let's go out and do what he's told us to do, to make disciples, to baptize, to teach people to obey everything that Jesus has said. God bless you, brothers and sisters. Enjoy your reading, and tomorrow we start a new book. We start the Gospel of Mark. God bless you.